Okay, we're going to be talking a little bit more about Saul and David today. Well, Saul continues to seek David relentlessly. Remember, David is hiding from him because he knows about Saul's anger toward him and Saul's desire to have him killed. Well, some of the men near David's hiding place wanted to gain favor with the king. So they went to Saul and they told Saul exactly where David and his men were hiding. And they even offered to lead him back to that spot. So obviously, Saul was delighted and he said, "Go and check in on this hiding spot. And then you come back and you give me a definite report. I'll find him if it kills me," Saul says. But news leaked out to David that Saul was on his way to the hideout, so David and his men went farther into the wilderness. Well, Saul pursued them all the more, and Saul and his soldiers were on one side of the mountain, and David and his men were on the opposite side of that same mountain. And it seemed like Saul was on the verge of overtaking David when a messenger brought news to the king that the Philistines had invaded Israel again. Well, with that news, Saul had to quit the chase and go fight the Philistines. Well, David, again, safe for a time, went to live in the caves of En-gedi. And after Saul had finished his battle with the Philistines, he set out again, pursuing David with 3,000 of his army. And David and his men went into a big cave far back into the dark innermost parts of the cave, and there they hid. Well, Saul was so tired from the long march that he goes inside the cave to lie down and rest. Well, he didn't know that the cave was large enough for David and all 600 of his men to hide in, and that indeed he chose to nap in the very cave that David and his men were hiding. So Saul goes into the cave, and because of the sudden change from the bright outside sunlight to the inside, he couldn't really see anything in the cave. He was completely unaware that he was in David's hideout and that David and his band of men were deep within that cave, standing along the walls with their swords ready to fight. And David's men could easily see Saul because Saul was between them and the light that was at the entrance of the cave. But the men quietly watched, and Saul came into the cave, but he just came in to lay down. And Saul couldn't see them, but they could see clearly. Well, Saul soon fell sound asleep, and David's men knew that Saul was now completely at David's mercy. And some of David's men whispered, "Now's your chance. Go kill him. Look, God has brought him right into your hands. If you don't kill him, he's going to kill you." David's men knew all too well that Saul had failed God in being the kind of king that he should have been. But David said, "No, he's the Lord's anointed." Well, David's soldiers wanted to kill Saul, but David would not allow them to touch him. Quietly, however, David creeps toward Saul as he lays sleeping near the entrance of the cave, and he slowly and quietly cuts off part of Saul's robe and carries it back to his men. Well, this way, he could prove to Saul that he had a chance to, but he chose not to hurt him. And eventually, Saul began to stir and wake up, and he sits up, and he got up and he walked outside the cave, and he joined his men, never even realizing that he had just been surrounded by David and his men, and he didn't even notice that a piece of his robe had been cut off. Well, David gives Saul some time to get part of the way down the hillside, and then David comes to the entrance of that cave, and he calls out to Saul, "My lord, the king." Well, startled, Saul turns around and he sees David standing near the entrance of that cave. And then Saul realized that David had been hiding in the very cave that he had slept in, and that David could have easily killed him, but he didn't. Then David stooped with his face toward the ground, and he bowed humbly toward Saul and said, "Why do you listen to people who say that I'm trying to hurt you? Today, you've seen that this is not true. I could have easily killed you while you slept in the cave, and some of my men actually wanted me to do that. but I spared your life. I couldn't harm you because you're the Lord's chosen king. See, I've taken a piece of your robe that I cut off, but I didn't kill you. Doesn't this convince you that I'm not trying to harm you? I've not sinned against you, even though you've been hunting me down to take my life. The Lord will decide between us, and He will be the judge as to which one of us is right, and He'll punish whichever one is guilty. Well, the king was so touched with David's words and at what had just happened that scripture tells us he began to cry. He remembered how much he had once loved David. And finally, King Saul said, "You're a better man than I, for you have done good to me while I was trying to kill you. Today you've given proof of your faithfulness. I fell into your hands and you spared my life. May the Lord reward you for the kindness you've shown me today. Now I realize that you are surely going to be king, and Israel will be yours to rule." So after this incident, Saul took his army and he returned home, and he quit seeking David's life. David and his men found another place to hide because they didn't know if Saul's kindness would last or not. David knew that God had said he would be king one day, but David showed self-control in not taking things into his own hands and putting Saul to death when he had the chance. Instead, David was willing to wait for God to fulfill his will and carry out his plan in his own time. Oh, that's a valuable lesson for us to learn, to let God work out the difficulties in our lives. If people don't like us or they try to harm us, then we can commit it to God and let Him take care of it rather than trying to get even or get back at someone. And David's an example of someone who, because he waited on God, had self-control in his life and he let God run his life. Saul, on the other hand, is an example of someone who had no self-control and tried to run his own life without God. We need to ask God to help us not to get back at others and let Him run our lives.